for the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm going to present or re-present a session that was done at NASPA a few weeks ago. It was done by actually 6 people, so I've kind of cut it down and tried to shave some different parts out so it flows a little bit better. But you might notice that there are some parts where we ask questions to the audience and those types of things, and clearly that's not as conducive to this environment, but I still wanted to leave them in there and give you a chance to kind of think through some things on your own. As I said, we presented this at NASPA. There were 2 of us that actually presented data, and then we had 4 people who presented their stories. And so it flowed a little bit differently a few weeks ago, but I think the data and the information itself is still very relevant. But you can kind of imagine how it might have been a little bit different when we did it at NASPA. So this session is called Multiracial 101, Join the Movement. That goes along with the theme of the NASPA conference, so that's why it's called that. But I still think it is Join the Movement. I think the multiracial population is really growing, and so we are a movement in ourselves. So I, as a presenter, will tell you a little bit about myself as well. I already told you what university that I work for, UT Austin. I am multiracial as well. I'm African American and Irish. I am also adopted by a white family. I'm from Nebraska originally, been in Austin for about 15 years, and I've worked at UT for that entire time. So that gives you a little bit of opportunity to meet me, even though we don't have a visual of each other, but I hope that that helps a little bit. So let's just start the presentation, if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. So the things that we'll talk about today are the following points. What does multiracial mean when we use that term, or various iterations of that term? What does it mean? I'll give you some data at a glance. We'll talk about data collection in colleges. I'll give you a little bit of historical background. We'll talk about the one-drop rule. We'll talk about Loving versus Virginia and those types of things. We'll talk about identity development, and then some inclusion ideas for campuses as well. Wanted to give you some practical information working with students on your campuses, or in organizations, or in counseling settings, or those types of things. We wanted to give you some really practical knowledge as well. So this is just a rhetorical question, I guess, for you, since we're in this format. But when you think of multiracial, what do people think? I'll give you just a second. So lots of things. What are you is really a question that multiracial folks get a lot. It's something that I grew up with as a question of random people who ask me questions all the time. My daughter actually just had the question last week. She's a 2nd grader, and her reading buddy, who's probably a 4th or 5th grader, asked her, "So what are you?" And as you can imagine, for an 8-year-old, that's a big question. In our household, we talk about this all the time. I am married to a white man. He is Irish, and so we are primarily Irish, but we are still black as well. And so we talk about that all the time. So you can imagine, for a 2nd grader, what do you say? How do you answer that question? So we thought as a group, when we presented this, of a couple of terms that we had experienced in our lives: multiracial, biracial, mulatto, Blaxican, which is black and Mexican, mixed, Hapa, which is Asian, Pacific Islander, and usually another race, typically white, mestizo, Eurasian, Blasian, interracial, et cetera, some other words that are affiliated with the term or with the concept, the one-drop rule, passing, and polygeneric. So one of the first questions to talk about today is, So why multiracial? So why don't you pick one? Well, and some people do, but people of mixed races often have trouble moving between the racial categories. Many times, a lot of you probably just submitted your census or completed your census. The multiracial community is very excited once again, really for the second time. The 2000 census was the first time we were able to check more than one box, and that is a huge thing for people in my community. And so why don't you pick one? Well, sometimes that's not as easy, and luckily on the census this time around again, we were able to check more than one box. But you can think of different reasons or places where people would only check one box. Lots of different applications on admissions applications, applications or for scholarships or things that our offices produce that may ask a race question. Do we allow students to check more than one box? How do we collect that data? Do we even know how to put that into an Excel sheet if we're counting our students that way? Those types of things are very large questions. So data at a glance. Here it comes slowly. From 1970 to 1990, mixed race births are up by 245%, 4 million people by 1990. I mentioned the 2000 census. Those numbers specifically, 6.8 million people identified as two or more races, which in the grand scheme of the United States population is about 2% of the population, but 6.8 million people, that's a lot of people, and that is a very exciting thing. Caravel and Fry are two researchers who suggested that by 2015, 2.6 million college students, 80% will be African American, Hispanic, Asian, or Pacific Islander. 37.2% of our total undergraduate enrollment will be comprised of minority students. And we say minority, you can kind of take that term how you want, kind of hits me in kind of an odd sort of way, but that term minority, and I think, well, you know, some of us consider minorities right now may not be considered a minority in years to come. A little bit more data, some charts give you some more information. 2000 census, people that mark two or more races, 6.3 million, 93% of the population of the 2.6% of the total population. Then there's some charts of people that mark 3 or more, or 4 or 5 or 6 or more races. So you can kind of get an idea from that as well. So in colleges specifically, the Maven Foundation is an organization out of Seattle. They really deal primarily with multiracial, biracial, mixed, whatever term that you want to say. Their foundation centers around that population. So they do a lot of data reporting as well. And so in 2005, they found the overwhelming majority of schools, 73%, don't offer multiracial students the ability to accurately identify their heritage. So did not offer them more than the ability to check more than one box. Only 9 schools that they surveyed met the federal standards and really allowed students to check more than one box, encoded the data, true to form, not collapsing people into specific categories. For example, if you checked black and Asian or black and white, not collapsing that person back down into the African American category or putting them in the Asian category. They were allowing, or they were counting them actually as people marked off. So that was really interesting. But this is something that we're going to be dealing with at colleges and universities, especially starting next fall. But back in 2007, the Department of Education issued a guidance that really said you have to allow students to check more than one box. So let's talk a little bit about some history. The one-drop rule As you may or may not know, a very old concept from